Dirk, please, you have the floor. As Ambassador Luminița Odobescu specified, there was a conference organized in Bucharest about the external threats to the European Union. This topic will not figure prominently during our conference, which is focused more on the internal divisions, internal problems. But still, we thought that your input about the external challenges and the need for coordinated response is mandatory for our conference too. So please have the floor.
Thank you, Alina. Madam Ambassador, dear colleagues. Indeed, why do we need a coordinated response? And, well, I only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to make a really short answer because we need credibility. But I think the question also mandates a little bit longer answer to that. And before giving the long answer, I think it's important that we try to identify some core values and inherent vulnerabilities of our democratic system, built around free and fair elections, as the ambassador has already stated. In the so-called Western democracies, the voters share some common values and expectations, and they expect that their votes will result in a government that represents the people correctly. Without wanting to be too exhaustive, I think the main cornerstones of the success of the democratic electoral process are that the people have an informed decision between the choices brought to them, which is closely related to the element of freedom of speech. The second core value is the freedom of choice, which basically is the main difference between the Western democracies, as they call them, and some more less free electoral systems where you have a single party which then gets 95% of the votes. The secrecy of the choice and the integrity of the choice. So in the ballot, your vote should remain secret, but we should have guarantees and we should believe that what we have said in the voting box actually is then represented correctly in the outcome. And the separate one, a little bit of an outlier in that, is the value of compromise, which may seem less important in a bipolar system, which is the case in most Anglo-Saxon countries, until you come up with a position like Brexit, which splits the parties in two. And then you have absolutely no way, or no, not only a way, but no history of making compromises, which is different in systems like in Belgium, where we have governments with at least the minimum government I've known had 5 parties. So compromise is inherent in that kind of political system. Linked to that, there are, of course, a number of threats. Some of those are not new. Some of those have always existed. And one of the first threats is foreign funding of our political parties. And strangely enough, in the still 28 member states, the rules on foreign funding are completely different. There are countries where it is forbidden. In my own country, in Belgium, there is no law against foreign funding of political parties. Linked to that, maybe less usual, it's also forbidding commercial funding of parties, which is in some countries absolutely normal, and in my own country absolutely forbidden for historical reasons. Disinformation in the past, propaganda, foreign propaganda, the main difference between old and new is the way in which it is distributed. In the past, it was mainly in writing, slow, not too widely spread, with pamphlets or whatever. Nowadays, it's through the internet, and you can even make it seem as if the disinformation that comes from outside of the country actually comes from inside. And that is a main danger. And then hacking. Hacking insofar as, even if you can simply make believe the people that you have hacked the electoral computers and have changed the outcome of the elections, you undermine one of the core values. There are also, and I know that's out of the scope of my presentation, I will not go into much detail, some internal threats like polarization, populism, censorship, and a false sense of ethics. What is appropriate. And in this case, I want to simply quote President Mitterrand, et alors, when he was asked if he had an illicit daughter. Who cares? It doesn't impede him from being a good president. Okay? In any case, if externals try to influence your electoral system, it's with an aim. And the aim is to undermine the credibility, to attack those values that I talked about. In doing so, they actually undermine the ability of the elected government to act either on the international scene or even on the national scene. Why? Because they want to promote their own political party, or they want to ensure their economic interests. Historically, democracies have proven to be very resilient towards external disinformation, influence from the outside. The values described at the beginning of my discourse are still a very strong narrative, and we have to believe in that. Therefore, the trap may be that we become too reactive on disinformation campaigns. We need to give the message, set the message by ourselves, starting from our own core values. There have been some cases, and that's the threat, where democracies have been undermined from the inside. Historical case in point, the Weimar Republic, for many reasons. The reason is that people in democracies, the reason that we are resilient is that people in democracies continue to trust the electorate leadership. So if you attack that trust, you really undermine the democracy. Then why do we actually need a coordinated approach? Well, again, we need a coordinated approach, first of all, to make sure that we communicate from what we believe in, from our core values, from what is written in Article 3 in the Treaty of the European Union to start with, Article 2. We need to reinforce the narrative of our democracy, including by educating our own population to be critical about the news they read. In the past, there were obligations in newspapers and on the television that any news had to be given with a little bit of information from both sides, so it had to be balanced. That obligation has fallen away already in the 1970s in the US, and later on with the commercialization of the press here in Europe also. And that's a threat. So people need to be critical. They need to realize that not everything they read represents all the possible opinions. A second or another reason why we need to react in a coordinated way is that we need to identify disinformation as soon as possible. And with 28 countries, that's probably a little bit easier than doing it individually. We need, whenever is necessary, to attribute disinformation to the external sources. And one example is the current disinformation that France and Belgium are planning a chemical attack in Syria, spread very recently in the Russian media. We need to expose the source of disinformation, which means we need to attribute it to those who have done it. And finally, and again, without being too reactive, we need to provide the correct information without being defensive. I think that concludes my points. Thank you.